Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to this class of the authenticity of Matthew. And I want to preface the class this evening with the following words, because many people have mistaken the purpose of these classes and think that we are dealing with something that is not proper. Pedagogically, we are using these classes in order to educate and make aware about the authenticity of Matthew and the issues of such. And we have been taking these classes both in Spanish as well as in English, and it's mainly being addressed to those who are involved in the Christian world, in the Messianic world, in the world of the Netzarems in particular as well, and those people, those Jews who are also involved in these groups, so they have a better understanding that there are some really major issues with what is called the Gospel of Matthew. And if you've been following along with us, you understand these issues are to the core of the fundamental assumptions of considering the Gospel as divinely inspired without error in these manuscripts. And we are addressing this issue because we need to explore exactly the authenticity of Matthew and the different manuscripts. And we've been doing this. We're now starting this evening in chapter 2 in order to awaken among those people who have been sleeping, you might say, behind the learning lessons, of the need to be able to literally look at what you have before you and the reasons why you're relying on some document or documents that was composed and put together in a canonical form to be called the New Testament. And when we go into this, we're going to realize there's a lot of problems with the copies and the copyists and the scribes that added and changed. And this is what we've been documenting through all of these lessons online. Now, we are on chapter 2, and we're going to begin reading from verse 1 of Matthew all the way through verse 23. And of course, I know there's a lot of my own fellow Jews who are basically upset at the fact I'm teaching on this through this means so publicly, but it's necessary in order to understand why we Jews, Orthodox Jews in particular, don't accept the Gospel of Matthew as authentic and is full of problems. But at least we're able to cope with it and deal with it within the actual manuscripts and the implications on the historical level. What is factual, we can assume as factual, what has been added into it, and be able to somehow come out to the realization of an aspect of what really took place. So I want you to join with me, and those of you Christians and Messianics who have your Christian Bibles, I'm using the King James, and we'll be looking at other versions as well, like as we've been looking at here. And we're going to be looking from chapter 2, verse 1, and all the way through verse 29 or 23 of chapter 2. We're going to be going through this chapter in this study. It says now from the King James, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all of the chief priests and the scribes or of the people together, he demanded of them where the Christ should be born. And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art thou not the least among the princes of Judah? For out of thee shall come forth a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him. Now, when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the child was. Now when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and there was until the death of Herod, that he might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, I want you to notice that he was mocked by the wise men, was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Now this then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, In Ramah there was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted, because they are not. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeareth in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise and take thy young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for they are dead, which sought the young child's life. He arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he had heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea, in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the part of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, that he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, obviously, it doesn't all read the same. In the Evan Bochen, the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, according to George Howard, we're going to read a little bit differently. I want to read it so you can have a contrast of the different concepts being presented here. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh bivaro. I want you to notice the difference here, and there's some major difference in the reading as well. And there's a lot of variance here. It came to pass when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah in the days of Herod the king, behold, astrologers came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is the King of the Jews who was born? We have seen his star in the east, and we have come with important gifts to worship him. And Herod the king heard and was dismayed, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him. So he gathered all his nobles and inquired from them if they knew where the Messiah would be born. And they answered him, In Bethlehem, Judah, as it is written, according to the prophet, You Bethlehem, Judah Ephratah, land of Judah, behold, you are insignificant among the clans of Judah. From you shall come forth to me one to be ruler in Israel. The king Herod called the magician in secret and asked them well concerning the time the star appeared to them. I want you to notice what it says here, the quote from the Evan Bochen. One to be a ruler in Israel. It's in the present tense. The king Herod called the magician in secret and asked them well concerning the time the star appeared to them. He sent to Bethlehem and said to them, Go and inquire well concerning the child, and when you find him, inform me, and I will go also to worship him, or to him to worship. And they hearkened to the king, and went, and behold, the star which they saw in the east was going forth until they came to the place when they entered Bethlehem. It stopped before the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly in great joy, and they came into the house, and found him and his mother, knelt before him, worshipped him, opened their sacks, brought to him gifts of gold, frankincense, myrrh, that is, myrrh. Then they were commanded in a dream by the angel who spoke to them, not to return to Herod. So they returned to their land by another route. As they were going, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto Joseph, saying, Arise, take the boy and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you, because they will seek the boy to kill him. So he took the boy and his mother, and was there until Herod died, to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Notice it doesn't mention which prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. The Herod saw that the magician had mocked him, and was very displeased. Being grieved at heart, he commanded by the word to be sent all his princes to kill all the male children who were in Bethlehem and its borders, who had been born from the time when the magician spoke to him concerning the birth of the boy. Then was fulfilled that which Jeremiah the prophet spoke. A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. And it came to pass, when King Herod died, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Now Joseph is in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the boy and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, because those who are seeking the boy to kill him are dead. So he arose and took the boy and his mother, and they returned to the land of Israel. Then he heard that Hyrcanus, his name is Archelaus, reigned in Judah in the place of Herod his father. And he feared to go there. So the angel urged him in a dream that he should turn unto the land of Gilgal. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, in order to fulfill what the prophet had said, he shall be called a Nazarite. Now, interesting enough, it is going to read Hanavi HaNazaret Yikra, to be called HaNazaret, which implies a Nazir. And we're going to look at that a little bit later, but it's a couple of points here. First of all, we know by history that Herod was made king. He was declared king of the Jew, being a proselyte, a convert, and thus did not have rightful rights to be able to rule. But let's go into here a little bit further. We're going to start with verse 1. There came wise men from the east. The Greek word here is magi, is a root word for magician. The magi were pagan astrologers. And you could take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 14. You could also see Acts chapter 13, verse 6, where the same word used for the word sorcerer. Clement of Rome, the earliest ante-Nicene church father whose writings are still extant, said in his epistle to the Corinthians in chapter 25, Let us consider that wonderful sign of the resurrection which takes place in the eastern land that is called in Arabia, in the countries around about. This is a certain bird which is called a phoenix. Now, this is the only one of its kind. It lives 500 years, and when the time of its dissolution draws near, it must die. It builds itself a nest of frankincense, myrrh, and other species, into which, when the time is fulfilled, it enters and dies. But as the flesh decays, a certain kind of worm is produced, which is being nourished of the juices of the dead bird, brings forth the feathers. Then, when it is acquired strength, it takes up the nest in which are the bones of its parents, and bearing these, it passes from the land of Arabia into Egypt, and this is called in the city of Heliopolis. And in the open day, flying in the sight of all men, it places them on the altar of the sun. Having done this, hasten back to its former abode. The priest then inspects the registers of the dates, and finds that it had returned exactly as the 500 year was completed. Here is the pagan fable about the phoenix, its death, rebirth, and its nest of frankincense, myrrh, all used allegorically regarding Jesus. Regarding this letter by the story by Clement around the year 100 of the Common Era was written before the appearance of the quote-unquote virgin birth story in Matthew, and it seems likely that this myth had an influence on the virgin birth narrative that was later inserted into this whole textus receptus. Now, we do have some other interesting points to discuss about this, because we're finding here a couple of different plays, and we're going to look at verse 2 now. And are come to worship him. The word worship in Greek here literally comes from towards and dog, to crouch as a dog. The word implies simply to bow down as a form of greeting or respect. In other words, to pay homage. Some would consider this as the giving due respect to a king. But, however, it is the norm in many cultures to pay this type of respects to divinities or demagogues. It is telling that the first visitors to fawn upon baby Jesus had been involved in a practice that's considered idolatrous by the Jews. Now, this obviously is not mentioned in most of the Christian commentators. Now, I'm going to look at something here which I recommend most of you pastors, if you don't have this, and Messianic leaders, you really should get this incredible work that has been published by Hendrickson Publishing Company, which is a commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud and Hebraic materials by John Lightfoot. Now, obviously, John Lightfoot was a Christian Hebraist, but it would bring you a lot of information to understand at least some little bit of the Jewishness or the Jewish culture of that time. And he makes a very interesting note that when Jesus was born, there was a scheme already set into motion. According to him, the year was when he was born was 3,928. Now, of course, he reckons this on page 26 and 27, dating back, going backwards from the temple was its building. It starts from the creation, from the promise in Exodus 7, and he goes counting forward. Now the sum came out to about 3,000, and it's clear that the building of the temple was finished and completed in the year of the world 3000. Now the temple was finished in the 11th year of Solomon. This is understand. So it begins to counting to try to give an estimate of the date of birth of Jesus, which obviously was not the 25th of December like so many Christians follow. Just the opposite. It happens to be more during the time, according to some, to Tishrei. During the period of Tishrei, some would even say Sukkah, which changes the whole entire situation altogether. So I recommend you pastors and Christians and Messianic leaders to really take a look at this commentary of John Lightfoot to be able to understand what we're looking at right now from a contextual position, at least a historical position, and the context of all of this, because one of the things we will learn is that Hillel had held government for 40 years prior to Jesus coming on the scene. And his son also held it after him, and his grandsons, in a long succession, even to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the Holy One. The splendor and the pomp of the whole family of Hillel had so obscured the rest of the families of David's stock that perhaps they believed or expected less that the Messiah would spring up from any of them. Yet, in the Babylonian Gomorrah, one of them almost persuaded that Rabbi Yehuda the Holy from the Hillelian family was the Messiah. And this is why it says very clearly in Sanhedrin 98:2 that that the Messiah would be, if the Messiah would be among the living, it would be like our holy Rebbe, the Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. If it's among the dead, it would be Daniel, or like Daniel was Daniel. So obviously, even the notion way back then of Jesus or Yeshua being considered for the Messiah was absent in the minds of that period of time. According to this, we see that the Jesus was born during the month of Tishri, somewhat answering around the month of September, where Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and immediately afterwards Sukkah would be born, which makes sense regarding the stable incident, the story of the stable where they had no place to relax their head, would be a perfect fitting illustration of this. And as we will look later in chapter 9, verse 27, some would perhaps suggest that this may be the actual time in which he was born. Now, there are some other areas that we're going to look at, and we're not going to go through every single verse in this chapter because so much things that we have to look at and very little time. But I definitely want to cover some of the major points in this chapter so we can move on and see some of the issues here that's been presented throughout the time. One of the things, like as we were talking about, if these magi's were actual astrologers, we have a problem. However, some have assumed and have stated that these were not magi's but sages that came from afar, as far east as the area of Persia. And they were involved in that time in the science of Kabbalah of that time, and they understood that certain odd signs would indicate a propitious time in which the potential Mashiach would be born. So according to some others, the view here is on a more historical. The Netzarim movement would probably support this type of concept, that this is what took place, and they believed that there was going to be born the neshama, like we saw in last week portion, the neshama of Mashiach was coming to the earth, as it were, and thus there was an impregnation. Okay, but we have now a problem, because if we read what we just read, we realize that this child was going to rule in Israel, and it's in the present tense. In other words, he was born to rule now, here, then, and now. It doesn't refer to a future that he will rule, but that he would rule Israel, present. Which begs the question. And the question we have to ask ourselves as we read this, did Jesus, during his earthly ministry on the earth, rule and was made king of Israel at any time? Over 2,000, say close to now 100 years passed by, and there's still no earthly rulership of this man who people held to be the Messiah. So there's a big problem here, and we're going to look at how that becomes a major issue when we look at some of the chapters, like chapter 12 in Daniel, when we realize that if he were to appear and disappear and reappear, he only had a 45-year gamut in which to do the whole job. It didn't happen. Okay, but that's more looking forward. There's also an issue that we saw very clearly in last week's chapter, and that was the fact that we came to the realization, according to the text, Jesus' father and mother was Miriam and Joseph, not as it was made into being the virgin birth story or reconstruction. For those of you who missed that, take a look at the other videos that we talked about that. Okay, let's go now to the following verse, and we're going to be highlighting, going back. In verse 5, there is a very important point here, which we read in verse 5, something that I need to highlight. And Bruce Metzger makes an adamant point on this, that there was a lot of scribal, let me tell you what he exactly says, scribal inflation or transmission copying to make it sound more legit. Not content with the mere mention of the expression, "for thus it is written," several witnesses, like in the Syriac and Coptic, added, we're talking about now adding to the manuscripts, the expression written by the prophet. And this is also how it reads in the Essiam Prophetam Decitem, through, in verse 5 of chapter 2, through the prophet Isaiah. However, you'll notice in some translation it does not say that in verse 5. It says, "And they said unto him in Bethlehem of Judea, for it is written by the prophet." That's the way it should read. Some has it by the prophet through Isaiah. So we see some conflation taking place here, some liberalities, when it should have been only written according to the most ancient manuscript, and this was added, by the way. "And they said unto him in Bethlehem of Judea," period. Added by the Syriac version, "for thus it is written." and it was added in other manuscripts by the prophet. So we see that there is even space to remove a lot of what was quoted as "for thus it is written." Also, we're going to see, according to Bruce Metzger, that in verse 18, and I'm going to read it real quick, I'm going to jump to verse 18 for a second, where again they cite the prophet, "Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying," it only goes up to, "In Ramah there was a voice heard." It stops there. However, listen to what it says, what Bruce Metzger says here. The longer reading in this verse 18 appears to be scribal assimilation to the Septuagint text of Jeremiah 31 verse 15, or in the Septuagint version, chapter 38 verse 15, and it was entered into the textus receptus. In other words, it was not added in, it was not found in the previous or other versions, and it lies behind the rendering of the American version, lamentation and weeping and great mourning. So if you have a pen there, you want to be a little bit puritanical, we've got to make some emendation on the blotting out things that were added. So in verse 5 we need to blot out from where it says, "For thus it is written," because we don't know if that was really there, and we need to remove that. Because now it says here, "And they said unto him in Bethlehem of Judea." That's it. In verse 18, "In Ramah there was a voice heard." Everything else erase. It was a conflation. It was an add-in from the actual Christian scribes that wanted to make it sound more legit. So all of that in the manuscripts were not present. Okay, now we're there up to there. We see some holes already here on chapter 2, 2 minimum. But let's go now to verse 6. "And thou Bethlehem, the land of Judah." This verse is from the passage of the prophet Micah in the Tanakh, which needs to read in its correct context. It's not being read correctly. The next verse, which is verse 2, says, "Therefore he, God, will deliver them to their enemies until the time that a woman in childbirth gives birth. Then the rest of his brothers will return with the children of Israel." This teaches that the exile will be as hard as a labor pain of women in childbirth, but that it will result in the rebirth of the Jewish nation. Wait a minute here. Aren't the Jews already in as a nation? Who's governing here? Keep in mind, the king of Judah was Herod. And the Hasmoneans basically were in control of the temple and had usurped the power and throne of the king of the Davidic dynasty, which we learned in Hanukkah, and the consequences of that action that came upon them. And those who have studied with me the Shulchan Aruch Yakut Yosef, that we learned during Passover, there was a major issue on this. That this is the reason why they understood that the Second Temple was going to be destroyed, because they usurped the seat of David. And when they were coming to the house, unlike the paintings, and this is we're going to go into the next verse. I'm sorry. It says here. So the issue here in verse 6, "In thou Bethlehem in the land of Judah, art thou not the least among the prince of Judah? For out of thee shall come a governor, and that shall rule." Now again, the term here is rule. The whole idea is ruling the people of Israel. If this is a fulfillment of the prophecy that we just mentioned in Micah, then this descendant is supposed to rule physically, earthly, a governor upon Israel. This is why the emissaries of Jesus later on in the book of Acts ask the questions. Are you going to restore Israel now? I mean, we're going to rule now? And if you notice in the book of Acts, it postpones it, leaving it up to the day and the hour that only the Father knows, in the book of Acts, chapter 1. So obviously, it was an issue tabled for a future time. And this is why I'm bringing back to circle this issue of chapter 12 of Daniel. Because chapter 12 of Daniel tells us that the Mashiach would appear, would disappear, and then would reappear again. There's no issue in that. That's what Rashi says. That's on chapter 12, based on chapter 12. The problem we have in there is the novelty of this concept of a second coming. And here we find a big problem with a lot of the Christian messianic, and let me say this, the Netzarim concepts. First of all, they never expected for the Messiah to die and then come back from the dead, and then to give him a second chance to come back and fulfill everything he was not able to complete. This is why many Orthodox organizations have declared that as being the statement of the early Christian movement, and have labeled modern day Meshiachistic movement under the same type of ban. This was accomplished by Rabbi David Berger in his book, the Rebbe, the Mashiach, and the Orthodox Indifference, which came to become a rule and a declaration by the RCA. Now, why is this so important to make that clear distinction? Because many people would think, well, once the candidate, the Messiah, dies, he still has a chance to come back. Or if he died and he rose again, he's still alive, Yachi Adonenu, therefore he is, therefore the certain Mashiach. We got a limited litmus test on that type of concept. It's only 45 years, according to Rashi. After the 45 years period is up and over, even if the person is said to have come and is no longer physically dead, he's alive, he misses the minimum time to come back and reappear and fulfill the rest of it. So thus, he's disqualified once and for always. Who says so? The Torah says so. The sages say so. So here we have an issue that he did not come back and rule and do everything he did. The bottom line is that if the Mashiach or potential Mashiach comes and does what's supposed to do according to the Rambam of Torah sages and doesn't get the job done in a certain time limit, sorry friends, he's just not the Mashiach. Just another would-be, could-be, should-have been in our history of failed potential messiahs. And believe me, our legacy in the Jewish history is one filled with failed messiahs. Yes, my friend, even with stories of resurrections. And we'll go into that later in the study of Matthew, which I think is so important, because we need, when we get to that point of the resurrection of the story of Matthew, we need to see it wasn't as people think. It wasn't Tekiyat Samesim. As a matter of fact, the word in Matthew, when you look at it, it doesn't even say that he was resurrected. It uses a different word in the Greek, which indicates that he just stood up. He got on his 2 feet. It's equivalent that when we say in prayer, Amud, or Amidah, that we stood up, has a whole different type of implication. But we'll look at that to give you the reasonable doubt on that, and we can talk about it. Okay, let's go to verse 11. So he says, then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired them diligently what time the star had appeared. He wants to know. He wants to give due credit to the true rightful heir to the kingship, which Herod was on top of, and of course, this was because he was a convert. And there's a whole issue on that, which I talk about that regarding who is a Jew, and in some of the topic on that in Spanish, but I've covered that. And that we may come and worship him. Not that they would worship him, but give him due respect. And when they heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the child was. When they saw the star, the Kokba, which also is very figurative of this whole messianic concept, the star came out of Jacob, and so that's why the connection of the star, and which was also the story of Rabbi Kokba, because his name was also indicated with the star. So they already understood this concept that there was with the coming of a potential Mashiach, there would be some type of astrological sign or wonder that would indicate that he is born. You're going to see that as a very common paradigm in all potential Mashiachs that have risen throughout the story. There is this miraculous birth, this wonderful story, this idea of wonders and signs taking place surrounding his birth, the child is imbued with certain special talents and abilities, and the people come to recognize that child's abilities, and they bring him gifts. This is very typical messianic, or I would like to call it Mashiachistic paradigms that are consistent in all potential Mashiachs that arise through the history of the Jewish people. And this is not the only one. We could trace this back consistently as a paradigm, a consistent paradigm. The only where the paradigm doesn't work is when you have this whole fictitious story of the virgin birth, and that's why this is completely foreign to the manuscripts. And we know it was added in. So now we're going to verse 10, where we read, and they saw this rejoicing exceedingly, saw the star, and they were come into the house. They saw the child with his mother, and fell down, and again gave him homage, which would be the correct word. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him the child. Presenting the child. We're just supposed to present it to the parents. The gifts of gold, zachav, and frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned of God. Who was warned of God? These were these wise men. This is why you can take them as either pagans, or you could take them as either as sages from the east that they were following through. Very wealthy people. There's a whole tradition about that. But no, let's just hold for there. Being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed to their country through another route. Okay, very good. So let's take a look at this. And where they were coming to the house, unlike many of the paintings and the scenes of Jesus, the Magi visiting Jesus in the manger, the writer of Matthew has Jesus in a house. Notice house. Bet. House is not a stable. So we have to ask the question when we look at the New Testament as a whole. So is Matthew correct, or is it Luke and John and Mark's version that's correct? Do we have them positioned in a stable or in a house? So how are we going to fix this mess here? We have a problem. Now, verse 11 tells us that we have an issue here, according to the Evan Bochen. And the Evan Bochen read, let's take a look here. The Evan Bochen read, Habayit. Uvaov el habayit, hamitzvachul ba'et. See, it's a bayit. Habayit is a house. Unless perhaps referring to the house of Mary, where Mary was staying. Okay, so we have an issue here now. We have a problem. The problem is when they came into the house. Whose house? Joseph's house? Mary's house? The house where the family is at. They presented all these things. So obviously, we now have a major problem. And this is the problem you pastors need to start working and thinking about. Because it's an issue. You're welcome to write a commentary. Where did Jesus receive the Magi's? In the stable? In the sukkah? Or was it in a private house? Was it in the inn? So we have a big problem here. This contradiction. We already saw a couple of holes in the manuscripts and how the Christian scribes added certain things that wasn't there. And now in chapter 2 we're finding another problem that contradicts to other parts of the synoptic gospels that contradicts totally the Matthew story. So which one is it? Matthew? Is it Mark? Is it Luke? Which one can we rely on? So this is the issue of the Netzarim. Netzarim, which one are we going to rely on? Of course you rely on the Besedot Matai. But they rely on the whole entire kit and caboodle. We have a problem here. Let's take a look at verse 12. And being warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed another way. Very good. We're going to look at verse 13 now. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Another dream. Arise and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. And be thou there until I bring thee word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. Not just destroy them, destroy him. Well, Herod was very clear when he was going to kill someone. He was going to kill everybody that was involved in the issue. So why does it say him. What's the issue here? Let's take a look at some other things. Flee into Egypt. So obviously now they were here, they were in their home. Now they give them instruction after this encounter of the Magi's. Magi's take off through another route, escape having to give an answer to Herod. And now we have, through a dream, so I have to assume it's going to be the following day, or the following night, because of course he falls asleep, they take off, and therefore Joseph has this dream, and this dream tells him, you gotta get out, you gotta leave, you gotta depart. Flee into Egypt, and Rashi in his commentary makes mention in Genesis 26:2 and explains that God forbade Isaac from going down to Egypt because he had been consecrated as an offering. We have another problem here. In verse 13, the voice is telling the child, you got to flee into Egypt, supposedly to save your life, because Herod is going to destroy it. And yet we have a big problem, because when something is consecrated to God, you're not allowed to be able to take it out of the land. And this is what Rashi makes mention in chapter 26, verse 2, and explains that God forbade Isaac from going down into Egypt because he had been consecrated as an offering. We can assume from here that Jesus was being consecrated for rulership. This raises a problem with the theological viewpoint that Jesus was consecrated as an offering before he was born, since his trip to Egypt would completely invalidate his status as an offering for the sin of the world. I'm sorry, you can't be consecrated, go out of Egypt and be reconsecrated again. No, that didn't happen. There's a problem here. But we're going to understand this problem, because this problem is again a conflation of trying to fit Jesus into the parallel of the suffering servant of the nation of Israel. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. Since they had to individualize the Messiah in the essence of a human being, taking the concept of Isaiah 53, which really, according to Rashi, speaks of the nation, but since a king represents the whole of the nation, it is referred to on the level of sod, of the mystical aspect of interpretation, to an individual, but not on the peshat, not in the basic simple meaning of Isaiah, neither in the midrashic level. So here we find how the writer, understanding these subtleties, is now going to weave a whole entire parallel story of something that happened in the past. How does he do that? Ingenious. He makes a parallel connection to the story of what the prophet Hosea says in chapter 11, verse 1, and he takes it out of context. In other words, he forces a parallel passage to be applied to this individual, forcing the basic interpretation of the actual passage of the prophet. What am I talking about? Let's go a little bit further so we understand here. So we understand. Verse 13, when he arose, he took the child and his mother by night, he departed. In other words, as soon as he got the dream, he got up, let's go, we got to get out of here. Verse 15, and was there until the death of Herod. In other words, they took off, went to Egypt, and they stayed there till Herod died. They might be fulfilled what was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I have called my son. Okay, we have a problem. We have a problem here. First of all, what does this refer to? Out of Egypt I have called my son. And why does the gospel writer of Matthew inserts this passage that is really placed out of context? In other words, it's a forced application of quote-unquote navuah, or prophecy, being fulfilled in the person of Jesus. There's a misapplication here. Out of Egypt I have called my son, says the author of the Noahide Guide to Matthew, Alan Cecil, which I recommend every one of you pastors, Christians, and Messianic leaders to really buy. If you need information on where to get it, I'll be more than happy to refer it to you. But out of Egypt I have called my son, and he quotes this from Hosea 11 verse 1. It is also taken out of context. The entire verse in the Tanakh reads the following. When Israel was a lad, I loved him, and since Egypt I have been calling out my son. This is a reference to Israel and the Exodus. God calls Kalal Israel, the children of Israel, the people of Israel, his son, his beloved son, not Jesus. This is one of the verses in that the Christians teach can be understood via the Gnostic interpretation, or as I made reference to, on the level of a Kabbalistic understanding. And so he takes this understanding as being the plain understanding of the passage, which is what I meant by misapplying a verse from the prophet to be forced on an individual situation. You're going to see that happen in many cases whenever any group or movement tries to present their quote-unquote Messiah candidate in the light of fulfilling the prophecies of the words of the prophet. And here you have a perfect example of rewriting the actual basic meaning of the words of the prophet to force it upon the fulfillment of the individual. This is typical, very atypical, of trying to paint the Messiah in the fulfillment of word of prophecy. This is not only happening in Christianity, this happens throughout history with Shabbatai Tzvi, with the Frankist movement, with the Davidic, the Reubenite movement, and the more recent movements that we in the Orthodox world that Rabbi David Berger makes mention of also experience this same type of paradigm comparisons to try to fit in and fulfill prophecy by drawing attention to passages forced out of its context to be applied to the individuals. Understanding what I just said before, that the Messiah King is in him the all, representing the all of what all Israel is all about. He becomes the focal point, the king, the head of the body. And thus this is the way they're able to apply, I would consider it, misapplication, misappropriation of a contextual passage of the prophet without complete comprehension of what's happening here. Now, verse 17, we go on. And Herod, when he saw that he was mocked, and the wise man was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had been delivered, and inquired of the wise men. Thus was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, stop there. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken. My friends, my pastor friends, my messianic friends, my Netzarim friends, there is no record, either historically or even by Josephus, or of any other record till this moment, of a murder of children by Herod in any verifiable source. This is solely an attempt to draw up a parallel between Jesus and Moses, to make Jesus into the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation, very similar to the paradigms that I mentioned before, that is consistent with making a person a Moshiach potential in every generation. This is atypical of all Mishachistim movements through our Jewish history. So we see here, even if they have to invent it, they have invented and forced stories in order to make it happen, to make it melodramatic. And I can understand this. Now, if for some reason in history we find out that there was a massacre, let's assume, of a bunch of children, I am certain to be able to say that not necessarily does it fulfill the passage of the prophet in this way. Because we already now have created a consistency of how they misappropriate, or how Matthew has been misappropriating passages of Matthew, along with the help of the church injecting more fluff into the story to give it more credence, which in fact hurts more than it does benefit. In Ramah was there heard a verse. Rashi comments, verse 18, that Jeremiah 31:14 is about Rachel pleading with God about bringing idols into the temple. 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 4 through 5, and reminding him about her generosity of spirit when she did protest when Leah was fraudulently married to Jacob. God acquiesced to her plea and promised that Israel would eventually be redeemed by her merit. And here we find that's not what's being said here. Rachel, the line of Judah, is Jesus and Levi. John the Baptist did not come from Rachel. Judah and Levi were the children of Leah. See Genesis or Bereshit chapter 29, verse 34 through 35, which makes this prophecy irrelevant. I'm going to jump to verse 23 because this is where we're getting to now, ready to the close. I would love to go into verse 22 because this calls now the following descendants of Herod, but because of the time limit. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, which might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, he shall be called a Nazarene. He shall be called a Nazarene, a Nazarite. The prophecy, as given here in the Greek in all the major sources, does not exist also in any of the Hebrew scriptures. One of the claims that Jesus fulfilled prophetic scriptures of the quote-unquote Old Testament, but all the prophecies here so far are inventions of the early church and are either taken out of context or, like this one, simply made up by later anonymous Christian scribes that we saw already in chapter 27, verse 9 through 10, as in the Gospel of John, chapter 7, verse 37 through 38, and as in James chapter 4, verse 5. These are complete, made-up fulfillment of prophetical scripture. Now, said that, the Nazarene will say, no, you understand, it doesn't read that way. Understand what it means that he would be called a Notzrit, not a Nazarite, not a Nazarene, like a Nazir that shaves his head and all that, but a Netzer, because it comes from the idea of a branch. So the question we have to ask, where were there a group of people who were considered the Netzers? In other words, like the branch. What city in Israel was considered full of the descendants of David that were considered viable candidates to the office of David? Because that would obviously indicate that he would be called a Netzarit, Netzer, not a Nazir, indicating of a line of Davidic, viable line of Davidic descent. We don't have it. It just only makes mention that a Netzer would come out from the stock of Yishai. And that's in Yeshayahu. So we have again a big problem. These are invented issues. These are invented prophecies and fulfillment. And here we have to beg the question. And the question we go again and beg. It says, even by Evan Bochheim, which the Netzerim movement follows, Hanavi HaNetzerit, Netzerit, and it's not HaNetzer. It's not Netzer like in the branch. We have a big problem, friend. And that is, no matter which way you look at it, chapter 2 presents major obstacles in the way of understanding exactly the authenticity of Matthew. As a matter of fact, the authenticity of Matthew in chapter 2 resounds with issues that plagues the rest of the Gospels that we will see it. And that's why I challenge you pastors. I challenge you Messianics. I challenge you Netzaremes to go into the source and produce and show forth reliable manuscripts. The problem is there's no original. Thus, in all the copies, what lies before the whole entire world is as the members of the Philadelphian church that Ignatius had mentioned. They're all corrupt and full of distortion. How can we really rely on the Gospel of Matthew to be authentic truthful and without errors if we have to delve in and see, and we've discovered so many problems. My friends, this is going to be repetitive, but we're going to go through this to be able to demonstrate one important premise, that there are things that have been consistent with Judaism that we'll find in Matthew that has not changed, and we can say, okay, that is consistent, that stays. But there are many things that were added, changed, distorted in an attempt for a reconstruction, or to beautify or to exaggerate the story in order to give it more credence, and that is all sheker. And once you have something that has a little bit of both, you can't really put your trust in it or in it without having to try to separate, to cut out the falseness from the truth, because you still may leave in some falseness, and you really don't know what you're dealing with. And this is why a lot of rabbis say, leave this shtus alone, leave it alone, don't deal with it. But I'm dealing with it for the sake of so many of those of my fellow Jews who are involved in Christianity. Many of you are pastors. Many of you are messianic leaders. Many of you are now still involved in a higher level of technicality than Netzarim. And this is why I'm doing this. I'm doing this to reach out to you and say, you know what? Come back home. Come back to the actual true emet source. And when you realize this becomes secondary, not of great importance. And if you wish to contact me, please do so. You can reach me at my email address at rabbiotero, R-A-B-B-I, Otero, at yahoo.com. Or you can go to our website, which is on radio, radiotorah.com. Radio Torah, that's Torah.com. It's all in English. And you can go learn and be involved with eyeshiva.com, which is learning about Judaism. And this is what we are encouraging. Those of you who are listening to my voice and want to get connected, either through B'nai Noach or through Judaism, you're welcome to write me. We'll plug you in. We'll get you involved. Pastors, you're welcome. We are not leaving anybody out. Here in Miami, we have now opened a center for learning for anyone who wishes to come. So that's going to be made public very soon. It's going to be in North Miami Beach, Florida, and we're going to have a lot of teachers and rabbis involved in giving classes and shiurim and a whole bunch of other stuff for Jews and non-Jews. So stay tuned and be connected to what we're doing with radiotorah.com. Shalom, shalom, and thank you for your viewership.